Companies are increasingly understanding the importance of two-factor authentication. We cover security questions, challenge and response mechanisms, and generic website 2FA to ensure that even if an attacker does get hold of your passwords, they're still not going to be able to gain access to your accounts. Many of us still use weak passwords that can be cracked with relative ease. Even the use of a strong password might not be enough to stop unauthorized access if the accounts that you protect with it are compromised in a data breach. Two-factor authentication is an added layer of protection that we should all be implementing wherever possible, and this will help to make it extremely difficult for attackers to gain unauthorized access to our user accounts, data, business network, and computer systems. The purpose of this lesson is to familiarise you with 2FA, explain how it works and its importance. We'll then take a look at security questions and some of the biometric controls available before looking at the attacker's perspective with Callum. So, what is 2FA? Two-factor authentication is a security mechanism that requires two types of credentials for authentication and is designed to provide an additional layer of validation that will minimize security breaches. 2FA is a type or subset of multi-factor authentication. It's a method of confirming users' claimed identities by using a combination of two different factors. Either 1, something that they know, 2, something that they have, or 3, something that they are. A third-party authenticator app, or TPA, enables two-factor authentication, usually by showing a randomly generated and constantly refreshing code which the user can use. The use of multiple authentication factors to prove one's identity is based on the premise that an unauthorized actor is unlikely to be able to supply the factors required for access. If in an authentication attempt at least one of the components is missing or supplied incorrectly, the user's identity is not established with sufficient certainty, and the access to the asset, whether it be a device, building, or valuable data, which is being protected by multi-factor authentication, then remains blocked. A good example of two-factor authentication is the withdrawal of money from an ATM. Only the correct combination of a bank card, something that the user possesses, and a PIN number, something that the user knows, allows the transaction to be carried out. Two other examples are to supplement a user-controlled password with a one-time password or an OTP, or a code generated or received by an authenticator. That could be a security token or a smartphone that only the user possesses. A third-party authenticator app enables two-factor authentication in a different way, usually by showing a randomly generated and constantly refreshing code which the user can use rather than sending an SMS or using another method. A big benefit of these apps is that they usually continue to work even without an internet connection. Examples of third-party authenticator apps include Google Authenticator, Authy, and Microsoft Authenticator. There's also a number of password managers like LastPass, for example, that offer this service as well. Authentication provides a method of identifying a user, typically by having the user enter a valid username and password before access to the network is granted. Authentication is based on each user having a unique set of login credentials for gaining network access. The AAA server compares a user's authentication credentials with other user credentials stored in a database. If the user's login credentials match, the user is granted access to the network, and if the credentials don't match, authentication fails and network access is denied. Following authentication, a user must gain authorization for doing certain tasks. After logging into a system, for instance, the user may try to issue commands. The authorization process determines whether the user has the authority to issue such commands. Simply put, authorization is the process of enforcing policies, determining what types or qualities of activities, resources, or services a user is permitted. Usually, authorization occurs within the context of authentication. After you've authenticated a user, they may be authorized for different types of access or activity. The final piece in the AAA framework is accounting, which monitors the resources a user consumes during network access. This can include the amount of system time or the amount of data sent and received during a session. Accounting is carried out by logging session statistics and usage information. It's used for authorization control, billing, trend analysis, resource utilization, and planning for the data capacity required for business operations. Passwords and security questions are one way of authentication, i.e. what you know, and there are some factors to consider while choosing both the questions and the answers. Firstly, choose a question that the answer is not easy to find on social media. Secondly, think about the fact that you've got the option to choose not to answer truthfully, so in the case of an attack, your personal information is not leaked. Best practice is to select the questions that only you know the answers to, or replace a true answer with a carefully selected and easy to remember answer, or store them somewhere secure, such as a password manager. Biometrics are body measurements and calculations related to human characteristics. Biometric authentication is used in cybersecurity as a form of identification and access control. It's also used to identify individuals in groups that are under surveillance. Characteristics commonly used are features of a person's face, unique attributes of their retinas, or the contours of their fingerprint. Faced with document fraud, identity theft, terrorism and cybercrime, and international regulation changes, new biometric security solutions are now being implemented. Even when the attackers don't have your username and password, they could bypass 2FA by getting you to click on a link and go to a phishing website that mimics a real website, such as LinkedIn. When you provide your login credentials on the fake page, the hacker can then use that to sign in on the real page. They'll also check for common security question answers on social media and use other OSINT techniques to build a profile so that they can try and get around certain types of 2FA. Overall though, most types of 2FA are now all but impossible to crack, and the attacker will have a really hard time getting around it. Let's see what Q thinks about 2FA and why it's so good and difficult for him as an ethical hacker to get around.
Multi-factor authentication is the bane of my existence. Multi-factor authentication is used to ensure that you not only have the piece of knowledge that you're required to log in, so your password, but it also uses things like, do you own a piece of property that you have? So say your phone. Are you in a location that they expect you to log in from? Are you logging in from the same device that they expect you to log in from? All of this stuff can be collated and collected by whoever you're logging into, and it allows them to not only gain a picture of whether you know the password, it allows you to gain a picture of whether you know the password, whether you have a mobile phone that has the code on it, or whether you have any other information that can be given to them so that they can collect it and ensure that you have the credentials to log in, essentially, the authorization or the authentication to log in.
Okay, so to round that up, 2FA is a really good way to make sure that an attacker, if they have your password, they're not going to be able to get into your account. So wherever possible, get it set up. Just to summarize then, we've defined two-factor authentication and we've explained how it works and covered how it's an effective and important security measure. Then we've looked at best practice around security questions and some of the biometric controls available before looking at the attacker's perspective.